As has been said, we are starting our Lenten series this morning. We're going to be focusing on the book of Colossians this year with Christ at its center. Today we're reading from chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. Reading today from the New Revised Standard Version. He, that is Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. This is the word of the Lord. Sisters and brothers, loved by Jesus Christ, dust. Dust, you know, the stuff that we brush off our clothes, that we vacuum on and sweep off our floors, that we wipe from our mantelpiece, that we clean off our shoes. Dust, that persistent, annoying dust. We just want to get rid of it. This past Wednesday, at Ash Wednesday service, we were reminded that we are dust. It's a fitting image of who we are because it reminds us of our sin and our frailty. It reminds us of the persistence of all of that in our lives, our mortality. Remember, you and I, we are dust, and to dust we shall return. To be reminded that we are dust is really a good place to start reading Colossians as a letter, particularly chapter 1. Because Paul says that God creates. God creates. It's God who creates dust. All things visible and invisible were created by God in Christ. God creates dust means that dust isn't floating randomly around the universe, but it is held together. It is fashioned and ordered into everything that Paul says we can see and we can't see. All things visible and invisible. Right down to the atoms, the electrons, the neutrons, right? The flowers and the redwoods, the mountains and the hills, the rivers and the lakes. It's all held together by God, created by God. Dust. This statement from Paul here in Colossians reminds me of being in first grade at Byron Center Christian School with Mrs. Bubbledyke, who taught us to sing fervently, "This is my Father's world. He shines in all that's fair, the rocks and the trees, the skies and the seas." She even taught us to emphasize those S's, right? In the rustling grass I hear him pass. He speaks to me everywhere. All creation, says Paul, is a great poem written by the hand of God the Creator. All in Colossians 1 means all. All means all, everything in creation. But Paul doesn't just stop there, right? Because all means all, says Paul, in society. He goes on to say thrones and powers and rulers and authorities. So all means all when it comes to institutions and politics and education and business and systems and law and justice. All means all, says Paul. But it doesn't end just in society. Paul also includes us, the church, when he says all means all. Christ, he says, is the head of the body, the church, the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. He is saying that Christ holds the church together. Here, the place where God gathers people to be transformed, to bear witness to the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, where we are gathered together to engage in practices of Christian formation, of virtues, of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness. And in doing so, we die to ourselves and are raised to new life. And Paul is going to say in the rest of this book that all means all in the church because it's centered on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that is the center of the passage. I was checking, I think I've said this before, I was checking with my favorite Bible scholar, my wife, Lisa. And when she heard that I was preaching on Colossians 1, she said, "Oh, did you know that is one long sentence in Greek?" In fact, what we read this morning was just a portion of one long sentence in Greek. It starts at verse 9, and it doesn't end until verse 23. We just read verses 15 to 20. One long sentence in Greek. Now, in Greek, you probably also know this. There are no spaces, there are no commas, there are no periods. So authors needed to focus your attention, or the reader's attention, on what their message was all about by using different tools, grammar tools. One way was to repeat words. And maybe you've heard it already this morning, maybe you heard it when I was reading, but the word that gets repeated, particularly in our portion of that sentence, is the word all. That little word all, A-L-L. It's repeated 8 times in just 5 verses. All means all. Not only that, but Paul, being the master craftsman that he is, hinges all means all on verse 17. The whole thing just sort of revolves, circles around the hub of that passage, the whole 9 to 23, on verse 17, as Paul wants us to say, hey, pay attention. So let's pay attention. Verse 17, Paul says, Christ is before all things, and all things hold together in Christ. All means all because Christ is at the very center of all things. In creation, in society, in the church. Now, to say that Christ is before all things, as Paul does in verse 17, he means Christ is primary. You know, he's echoing Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He's echoing John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and through him all things were made, and nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humanity. Paul is saying that Christ is primary. The second thing he says is that Christ holds all things together. Christ is the tension that holds all that creation and society and the church together. Which raises a question. How does Christ do that? I mean, I find it hard to believe sometimes that Christ is holding it all together. And it seems like so many things are spinning out of control. How can all mean all? Really? I mean, does that include the children baptized at this font who are now walking away from faith? Does all mean all? Does all mean all for single moms, for drug-addicted executives, for orphaned children? Does Christ hold all that together? Does Christ hold together the complex, beautiful biology of being human, all humans, in the same way that he holds together the complex biology of a daisy or a redwood tree? Does all really mean all? In politics? In education? In business? Does all mean all? Because somehow it seems as though Jesus has lost his grip on everything. It spins out of control. How is it that Paul can say all means all things in nature, society, and even the church, that they belong to Jesus, that Jesus has his hold on them? Because when life spins out of control, it is hard to believe it. It's hard to know that it's true. It's hard to live as though Christ holds it all together. I think that one way we try to hold it all together is to contain it. Right? We put water in a container to hold it together. We put wine in a chalice. In that way we hold it together. We put a border around a country to hold citizens together, right? We put fences around cattle to hold them together. We make them barbed wire to hold them in, and we keep the predators out, right? We hold things together by building containers. I don't have to remind you that throughout history that happens in the church as well, right? Build fences to identify who's in, who's out. But is that the only way to hold things together? To build a container, a fence? Well, it's not. It's not the only way to hold things together. I was reminded of that. I heard this story about a visitor to the Australian outback. Vast space, the Australian outback. This visitor was visiting a rancher and noticed that his ranch did not have any barbed wire fences, and he asked about that. How is it that you keep track of your cattle without fences? And the rancher said this, "Oh, that's no problem. That's no problem." He said, "Out here, we dig wells rather than set up fences." He says there's no need to fence cattle in when they are highly motivated to stay within the range of the water, which is their most important source of life. You know, when I about how Jesus is presented in the Gospels? Isn't Jesus a little bit more like a well in the outback attracting cattle than he is like a fence deciding who's in and who's out? I thought of all kinds of examples, but I just want to land on Peter, the apostle Peter, right? The disciple Peter, that fervent, prejudiced, exuberant, Jesus-loving, passionate Peter, because I just relate to Peter. And Peter is written in such a way, his character is such a way that I think you relate to Peter as well. And I think about Peter. How did Jesus hold Peter when he got out of the boat and he was full of faith and he was walking across that stormy sea in one moment? In the next moment, faith is gone and he's sinking below the waves. Think about Peter who declared above and before all of the disciples that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then when Jesus is arrested, he bolts out of the Garden of Gethsemane and he denies even knowing Jesus to a serving girl. How did Jesus hold Peter? It's an important question. Did Jesus hold Peter? Peter, who Jesus declares is the rock of his church, the one that Jesus wants to hang on to. Did he fence Peter in? Or did he offer Peter living water? I think that's an important question for a church that's built on Peter, who is the rock. How does the church, how does this church hold Christ at the center, who holds all things together? There is a church in Copenhagen, Denmark. It's called St. Matthew's Church. It's a Catholic church. And at the front of the church, the chancel is a big half dome. And that dome, that entire dome, is filled with a painting of the Sermon on the Mount. And now you remember it's Denmark, so Jesus has blonde hair. But it's okay. It's okay. Because Jesus is at the very center of that painting, and I've asked Teresa to show us Jesus at the center of that painting. The entire church now, just try to imagine this entire church, this dome is the Sermon on the Mount, and at the very center of the painting is Jesus. And everything in that painting and everything in that church is directed toward Jesus. Jesus is the center of their worship every week, quite like visually. And I wonder what it would be like to be part of that church taking communion every week with Jesus at the center, and how has that shaped their ministry? And as I thought about that, and as I looked at that painting closely, I noticed Jesus' right hand, his right hand like gesturing up to heaven, right, and his other one to the crowd. And if you followed Jesus' arm down his elbow there, you see that guy? You see the guy, he's looks like he's turned away from Jesus. His back is to Jesus, certainly, but his face is turned toward Jesus. I'm wondering, is he coming or is he going? Is he on the fence? I tried to imagine having communion at St. Matthew's Church in Copenhagen, and I think I'm that guy. I think you're that guy. I think we're that guy. And I wonder if we could be a church for that guy. Could we be a church for that guy? And I hope we can. Because that guy is made of dust. And Jesus came to this earth, and he preached, and he ministered, he died, and he rose again for that guy who was made of dust. Could we be that church? And what would it look like for us to be such a church? I've asked Teresa if she'd leave that painting up for us today, just during the prayer, the liturgy for communion, so that as we go through the liturgy today, I invite you to consider that guy. Consider those times in your life that you've been that guy. You've turned away from Jesus, those times you've turned toward Jesus, and consider how Jesus has held on to you. Jesus, who says to everyone, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest." And that's his invitation to the table today.